Hello everyone, today we talk about the legal mentions of the German Ministeriales, this class of servant knights that was quite employed, in fact, in the various branches of administration, but they're masters in the German High Middle Ages. And that, as a name, we have already explained in other videos, so I'm not going to digress on this. There is a playlist known as German Knighthood that doesn't talk just about the Ministeriales, because of course there were also the free knights, but as you know, the former came to make up the wide majority of some of the most important parts of Germany by the second half of the 13th century. It's estimated that 90% of the southern German knights were, as a matter of fact, Ministeriales at that point. Through their career and through the mentions that we will in fact observe today, also at least that these juridical ones had made a fortune as an estate, first of all, and many of them were even richer, more powerful than the actual noble knights, and this is something which would die out as a legal distinction, by the way, in the 14th century. Basically, that rank was recognized by status, and the idea of the original serfdom was practically abandoned, even though basically all knights were undergoing an important crisis because of the affirmation of the most powerful German princes. A bit as we've seen in other regions of Europe, there is a lock of the highest offices, right? These knights become impoverished. There are lots of things going on. Again, made lots of videos about Germany during the interregnum and the more, say, the broader princely phase. Today we did not talk much about that because, as you know, the Ministeriales were sort of the armored wing of the, in fact, mainly of public power, the imperial one, but also of the ecclesiastical ones. This is quite fascinating. The reason being that essentially the monarchy in Germany was using these the Ministeriales were really actually used by all the lords in Germany, but the public authority would entrust to these guys more tasks in order to preserve better the sort of centralized public institution state that eventually would fail in the 13th century, so that you have that princely phase, the taking over properly of the privates, but also among the ecclesiastical lords, because these were, generally speaking, doesn't matter how warlike, as German bishops, weaker than the lay ones, right? So they needed somebody else fighting for them, also having specific rights of advocacy, for example, because, as you know, the clergy could not comminate capital punishment. Germany is really a mess in terms of jurisdictions, intertwinement, superposition, and so on. And we have already showed this abundantly as far as also as the Ministeriales are concerned, right? But in any case, these people were quite useful because, a bit as we've seen in other classes of servant soldiers abroad, you wouldn't have to give them anything, right? First of all, you could simply buy these guys, sell them, whatever, and their serfdom was making them naturally depending on you, right, against other people of status that, as they of course existed in Germany. The Ministeriales emerged mostly as a thing peculiar of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, especially in Ottonian times. So when in fact a proper monarchy was to rise, right, and trying to unite in some ways this otherwise quite divided and fragmented land, and you simply didn't have they didn't have inheritance rights, at least in the classical dynastic fashion that the freemen would enjoy. which meant that basically it was much easier to retake all the various possessions. You would entrust them to, in fact, administrate. The ministerium, etc. It literally stems from the Latin etymology of ad minus, that is to say that the administrator is he who is deputed to the lesser things, right? Because they are the ones that need to be taken care of practically, whereas the true freeman is just somebody who rules, commands, and has these orders executed by their followers, right? So there are really that's why the Ministeriales are so fascinating, by the way, because there were lots of things, right? First and foremost, exterminators, because that's objectively and legitimately the only thing that a medieval knight can be. But of course, as out of the military space, they had this broader capacity that, of course, as people who worked quite hard and competitively for their masters that entrusted them again with this important amount of estates, etc., had a broader, say, relevance in Germany, where the problem was exactly at this point that everybody was more or less somebody else's person. There wasn't really much of a sense of freedom other than the one that the nobility had controlling the population. So the Ministeriales were a sort of giant middle finger from public authority that was struggling to affirm itself, to basically give them, free reins to carry out a lot, right? And these guys would in fact have pretty risky and terrible lifestyle in many ways, but that's what they were willing to die for, even to increase their own condition, right? To improve their own condition. It's something we've seen in Germany also happening with the Landsknechte later, as always a mean of redemption, of transfiguration, of successful cooperation between the elite and these dispossessed, all right, against mostly the hard stock mob of the nobility that, especially in Germany, takes everything over without a previous time of a real state, so that this public authority was just, of course, working on a private basis, not very differently actually from the ones of I don't know, England or France. Comparatively, but again, in a land where the balance was dramatically shifted in favor of the privates in the first place, so that monarchy would fundamentally collapse by the 13th century. And so a bit that, in fact, the very raison d'etre of the same Ministeriales for how that country specifically had been developing at that point. But again, it's something we will not be seeing now. And the interesting thing is in fact this, that even though the Ministeriales were not free, they were not actually barred from administering a law in all its forms. The imperial and civil one, but also the feudal, urban, mercantile customs. This extended also on the military sphere. As we've seen, there was also the law of advocacy over the church, even ruling the Landfrieden, that are, as you know, one of the most important features in the public institutions of medieval Germany. That is to say, this sort of peacekeeping truces and associations that, of course, even as knights, they were able to enforce. And these were normally issued by public authority. It was a public prerogative, and later on they also privatized further, but the limit was blurred even before. Just as long as there was a king, of course, that was the most obviously legitimizing authority also for those who wanted to carry such pacification out. Under Frederick II, the chief justiciars of the imperial court in the kingdom of Germany were free-born noblemen. However, for generations, the Ministeriales had delivered opinions and approved and passed sentences in the imperial court in general cases, as well as those concerning only the Ministeriales. This is fundamental because you understand, of course, the free nobility of Germany, it was quite powerful, had this privileges and was considered, as we'll see now, well above, especially in a princely sense, of course, the judgment of a serf, right? Otherwise, however, and especially the lesser aristocracy was judged by the Ministeriales not as individual serfs, but as essentially on behalf of the emperor and public authority, right? The Ministeriales was just the hand of the monarchy, and or of whoever owned these guys as a literal property, right? So that in an imperial or general, say even private situation, the Ministeriales could be called by his own master, say, what do you think about this, right? I give you this faculty, given that you're basically using it on behalf of me. As we will see, these guys were given seals. They were men of trust, as you understand it. That's why they were chosen, and because, again, being a serf would have not made them that lucky outside of that realm. So that ensured a significant degree of loyalty in such affairs. In 1227, the Bishop of Liège asked in the king's presence that the Count of Flanders, I made a video about medieval Flanders just the other day, suit against the same bishop over the Margraviate of Namur should be judged specifically by imperial ministeriales, right? Who, in fact, duly took counsel with the princes present and delivered the sentence. Right. This is particularly important because it was a way to say at the royal court, look, I want some imperial trustees to take care of this matter, which Margrave was, of course, causing problems to a bishop, by the way, which I made a video about, yes, how these things happen, not specifically in Flanders, but in the neighboring Lotharingia, etc. And it was a pretty fragmented, turbulent, and also institutionally confused region in the first place. There were all these intersections, even with the County of Flanders, etc. And basically the princes are okay with that, right? When we talk about German princes, we're talking about the high nobility fundamentally, right? So these guys accepted to have the imperial authority in the best of the ministeriales to judge, right? So in a way that was fundamentally negotiated with the ruler. There is a famous juridical case in feudal custom concerning the abbey of Saint Remigius at Reims, the very most important, that had connections with the empire by being in France, right? So never underestimate in the sense how we are in the 12th century. There would still be not just an unavoidable sort of overlapping of authorities in such region, say pretty much close to the Holy Roman Imperial frontier, but how, of course, the empire was meant to dispense justice also abroad in a way. And the abbey, that, as you know, is connected with the entire French mystique and royal cult, etc., complained to Conrad III court at Frankfurt. We are in 1149, the Swabian, already the Swabian monarchy, about the usurpation of its German possessions by the Ministeriales Albert of Cousel, who had essentially refused to appear in Rennes to answer these charges against him. So it's fascinating because essentially you have this abbey having some possessions in Germany. This had been usurped, or at least this is what they claimed. The guy had not showed up because those are in the Kingdom of France. But here the abbey turns to the very German sovereign, and the king asked at that point to his ministerialis Conrad of Hagen, quote, what the rule of law held concerning this controversy. He replied, with everybody essentially agreeing that all vassals, whether freemen or ministeriales must answer in their lord's principal domicile to accusations of such nature, right? So they were literally asked for a juridical expertise, right, and opinion. So they weren't just some violent enforcers of royal law, but they were actually also some thinking minds behind the same decisions, so just to support the same sovereign in establishing such matters of here literally also international law, right? Because they were going across the boundaries of what at least the Holy Roman Empire had been establishing itself at this point. So pretty much everywhere in Germany, the ministeriales acted in such way as judges, commissioners, arbitrators for their own lords, for the church, for the emperor, for neighboring princes, even. So they could, as we will see now, called right from other places. This is the interesting thing. So that with the permission of their masters, they could go dispense this sort of legal judgment. There was, of course, an internal knightly, the knights would become an estate proper in the Holy Roman Empire. And therefore the ministeriales had a great power within that, as also they were rising dramatically in just in number, but also in general quality, relevance. And of course they would also take care of their own manorial jurisdiction over their lands, villages, and serfs, because of course the ministeriales, as we've seen, were entrusted with the administration of a castle, of land, of communities, and so they were responsible for that, right? They could, of course, they would be in contact with their masters and everything, but generally speaking, they were, in fact, as the name, as we explained, said, take care of the matter, preferably by themselves, because otherwise what kind of administrators were they? In the 12th and 13th century, we see that the most powerful princes in Germany organized their jurisdiction over crimes such as homicide, theft, rape, pillage, and other very serious offenses into some local tribunals of provincial scale, fundamentally known as the Landgerichte. They were, I say provincial, we were talking about the land as, say, I don't know, maybe there wasn't a fixed, just everything was very fluid. They could call again people from elsewhere, but say the Saxons would take care of their matter, the Bavarians of their own at Similia, and of course in these tribunals, the princely ministeriales acted as judges and advisors, just as we have seen. When King Ottokar II, Przemysl of Bohemia, became Duke of Austria, he required, for example, his ministeriales to attend the Austrian Landgericht to literally help the court as legal counselors. If the Landgerichte were rural, most of the times in character, meaning that Germany again was, there was a urbanization, especially in the south, in the west, but it was, of course, an overwhelmingly agricultural country, and the cities especially didn't have so much power outside their own gates, right? Germany is characterized by the fact that, yes, there were free cities, etc., important centers, but fundamentally just outside of that, it's the prince that rules, right? Either the lay one or the bishop. We'll keep talking about this. So the most important amount of properties, of course, was in the countryside, right? But the larger towns, of course, had their own magistrates. Most of them, as you can guess, were ministeriales, such as the Archbishop of Mainz, Scultete, which, as you know, in Latin is a term that recurs as, essentially judges of some sort at the very Mainz, that, as you know, was an ecclesiastical princely elector of the empire, and Fritzlar, Erfurt, right? So, as you know, also the German principalities take this very territorially and not necessarily contiguous character, right? In 1225, the Bishop Engelbert of Osnabrück agreed with his townsmen that, remember, figured as a community subjected to him, but in a literally contractual relation, right? Because the bishop naturally had that lay investiture for that, right? But it was separated from his secular ecclesiastical office. This is very important. That the magistrate of the town would be, or the magistrate in this case, of Osnabrück would be a ministerialis chosen by him, the bishop, and approved by the townsmen, right? So it was just a way to negotiate on fair play, right? Say, we have this share, we share this prerogative. I choose the guy, but if you refuse it, you can deny him. We'll choose another one, and because obviously he had to be an impartial individual, hopefully, to judge over these matters in Osnabrück. The ministeriales, as knights, as we were saying before, were also judges of their peers. For example, in the lord's household, a bit like King Arthur, you have this feudal court, everybody sits around, and they solve matters as peers, ideally. Also, and this is particularly important, the ministeriales were provided with the administration, these administrative duties, as vassals of their own lords. Meaning that even though they were not freemen, still their lord that owned the beneficium could simply say, well, okay, yes, I can entrust it to this serf, because it's my serf, and the beneficium is mine, so I do whatever the hell I want with that, right? Which made the ministeriales naturally at the same level of vassals, including the free ones, whenever a feudal controversy would break out, right? Because at that point, again, they were acting on behalf of their master, and if there was a feudal problem, it was not a matter of and you were just the vassal handling that possession, and you were just an extension of your lord. Of course, the ministeriales would be au pair with the other guy in practice, as far as the controversy was to be settled, like juridically. As vassals, the ministeriales, in fact, delivered opinions and sentences. They settled disputes about thieves that were granted even to counts, right, free lords and free-born knights. There was still of course, as we'll see now, a level, right? The princes of the empire were not really, they could not be judged, right, by a serf. But counts, other free lords of lesser condition, freeborn knights, could be judged by the ministeriales serfs. And this is fascinating. It tells you again how powerful the latter actually were. It was an imperial enactment of 1222 regarding the feudal custom in Lotharingia. Consider that every German land in this regard had, as its really tradition, a law of the land plus a feudal law, and then there is the public one, and they're all intertwined, but they of course differ as such from land to land. And this enactment had stated that, quote, in feudal law, every enfeoffed ministerialis can pass judgment equally over fiefs of free noblemen and of ministeriales, though not over fiefs of princes. Right? So at least at that higher level, they couldn't quite act. Right? However, exactly in this case, it is what the Bishop of Liège asked them in 1227, right? So it is really to do, which is something that exactly what would happen 5 years later when the Bishop of Liège asked them to do exactly this, right? So this is again fascinating because that was a bit more of a peripheral area of the empire, where also public authority was very intermittent, to say the least, and there was no real local, say, center of gravity. We can put it in this way, and there were actually fierce struggles as far as also imperial interference, trying to back this or the other was concerned. So Ministeriales were called also to, as sort of authority, to say, okay, well, let's see what they deliberate, and let's see if they can put even the princes to their place, which again is really fascinating. There is even a more typical case in which the Archbishop of Cologne, in this case the most powerful of the ecclesiastical princes in the empire, in 1279 commissions 3 of his ministeriales, namely the butler of Aar, the burgrave of Lechenich, and the marshal of Westphalia, to settle the claims to Mühlenach castle, that was a fief of the archbishop, between 2 free-born noblemen. This also, you see, the Marshal of Westphalia, for example, this guy was really entrusted with the military of the land. That was one, at least, it was a consistent one, right, overall, and here on behalf of the bishop. So the Landgerichte as town courts, as well as magnate households and feudal courts, could be called up relatively frequently. The ministeriales could be employed in the role of commissioners, judges, and assessors in some other ad hoc courts set up for investigation or arbitration reason. For whichever purpose, really. And there were really many to take care of in Germany at the time. The arbitrations proved quite effective, interestingly enough, as an alternative to the inconvenience of essentially letting the freemen killing each other, where we have seen there were terrible feuds. We've seen the one of Eichstätt in Bavaria between the bishop and the count. They were extremely bloody. A way to settle things, and or at least to say, well, okay, let's presume that there are some guys that are a bit above the situation. Let's call this ministeriales from somewhere else, and let's confer, say, them this authority, at least to provide with a reliable insight on the juridical situation. And this would go just like lawyers. Essentially, there was an equal number of ministeriales representing the contending parties. The court was presided over by some impartial chairman. It could be a churchman or a vassal from another retinue for the same purpose, basically. But, say, with these two teams of ministeriales / lawyers, and people who could put hand to their sword, by the way, interestingly enough, were essentially to deliver this judgment and settle the matter, hopefully. We mentioned the Bishop of Eichstätt and the Duke of Bavaria. As far as at that point a general settlement was called under the chairmanship of the Marshal Henry of Pappenheim, dividing up the Count Gebhard of Hirschberg's inheritance between them and Geimersheim in 1305. We've seen this again exactly in that episode. This was the two sides that were really fighting against one another. And this was essentially a compromise which awarded essentially the allodial possession to Eichstätt, which was a big deal because the allodium, as you know, is this land you can't basically confiscate. Not even the king can say, well, let's pass it to somebody else, because it's just fully owned as a freeman, and at least one of particular importance to trigger basically any other effect of these actors in the kingdom. It's a sort of constitutional right? However, the criminal jurisdiction was assigned to Bavaria, because at least the problem was, as always, that the clergy could not quite administer it. And interestingly enough, that settlement of the beginning of the 14th century would last for half a millennium. Right? It was in vigor until 1803, and this was simply based on a sentence emanated by Ministeriales back in the day. Right? This is how you settle problems there. Consider that in the 14th century, of course, again, the ancien regime kicks in fully, and you have therefore a situation that is crystallized as much as essentially the fragmentation of the German monarchy at that point. So all these mosaic, again, is fixed through these legal issues until Napoleon, practically. The records of the investigative commissions provide us with an incredible variety of works undertaken by the Ministeriales. Right? Really, the fame, the authority, the prestige that they had locally among the communities, and the same establishment. In the early 12th century, Bishop Otto of Bamberg institutes the rights of his proprietary monasteries at Osterhofen, Ehring, and Asbach over to their manors and serfs. So what he does, he sends a commission of ministeriales to settle what the manorial revenues, services, and jurisdictions were essentially to be. In 1157, the new ruler, Frederick Barbarossa, instructs 5 Thuringian ministeriales to visit Pforte to protect the monastic property from its jackals, right, that were roaming around, also in that sense infringing public and ecclesiastical rights, and to survey, in fact, also this foundation by an extent as bodyguards, fundamentally as a garrison, right? This tells you really what they were about, and so to be really there as figures, also at the risk of their life, right? And that Frederick Barbarossa was essentially to energically, to say the least, reaffirm royal authority in unprecedented ways in Germany and beyond. In 1188, the Count Palatine Rudolf of Tübingen wished to acquire some lands from the See of Speyer for the benefit of a new monastic foundation. And at that point, the Bishop of Speyer sent 10 of his ministeriales to essentially assess the value of such lands offered in exchange. And this came, the ministeriales came up with the judgment that those lands actually were better and more useful than those that were to be surrendered by the bishop. So the deal was significantly determined by it. So again, you see how skilled these ministeriales were. As men of war, men of business, fundamentally, of law, of politics. This is essentially the equivalent also of other knights in Europe. I mean, the fact that these were servants doesn't mean that they were essentially different from any other knight, right? They're basically all the same, but every country in Western Europe has its own way to it, right? They have different characteristics in their background, right? And this is at least a German one. In 1191, the Bishop Dietrich of Gurk sends a deputation of Ministeriales to his father, Rudolf of Albeck, right? And the point is that Rudolf's other only heir had died during the Third Crusades, as you know, in those years. And essentially, Dietrich manages to convince his father to give up all the family possessions to the bishopric of Gurk, right? So not as a given that the guy again was now a bishop, could not really unbishop himself, and that there was still a possibility, of course, having other heirs, decided spontaneous as a free lord, and Rudolf decides to give all these possessions to his son as a bishop, right? This is also fascinating. In exchange, the Ministeriales assigned Rudolf a life income at that point from episcopal revenues, so that of course he would keep essentially enjoying part of his of these, even if they had become his bishop's son's possessions, and the huge manor at Valkenburg, which, however, the father was forbidden to pledge or to sub-infeudate, interestingly enough, so that, of course, the bishopric there had basically taken control. In 1239, there was also a long dispute over some woods between the abbots of Isny and Kempten. Woods were incredibly important, a bit like you have for example, in England with the royal forests that didn't even have to be forests. Technically, it could be moors, whatever. Still today, are as they're important. Also in Germany, forests were normally in Europe this public domain possession, or had been taken over by some princes that were essentially controlling it, either on behalf of public authority, etc. However, were enormously precious resources, to say the least, right? And there was a dispute, in fact, between this abbeys specifically. At least this woodlands were not necessarily and originally public, but what I mean is that really could get, like, for, I don't know, pigs grazing, for wood production, for hunting, right? They were really a bit the property of the great lords in some ways. Well, in this controversy, a commission of ministeriales was called to settle the matter, together, however, with free-born noblemen under two judges that were Conrad, butler of Winterstetten, and Otto Berthold, seneschal of Waldburg. And these were ministeriales of the imperial household. So you have a commission of ministeriales and noblemen, free-born noblemen, presided over by imperial ministeriales. And so you see the juridical certainty and security of this mean of resolution. Around 1260, the Bishop of Passau instructed his ministeriales and the townsmen of Gallneukirchen to settle the laws of the town and to decide essentially how often the magistrates should visit it. In 1276, the Duke of Brunswick sent his Marshal Burkhard of Asseburg and his advocate Godfrey of Vorsfelde to adjudicate a dispute about property between an abbey and a knight. Again, a very varied set of circumstances for which the ministeriales are all there, right? There is, in fact, for this reason, the tendency to, let's say, institutionalize the ministeriales beyond just the contingental deal, right, as lawyers of some sort at those levels. For example, when you look at the peace treaty between the Count of Hirschberg and the Duke of Bavaria in the 19th or 13th century, you realize that the Ministeriales there were acting as sort of a bit even, not just as on a higher sphere, but as some sort of professionals of the craft. In 1245, the bishops of Osnabrück and Münster drew up a treaty, renewable every 5 years, between which times a committee of 6 ministeriales would endeavor to arbitrate in armed feuds, meaning that those ministeriales and or others that could take their place were essentially to supervise continuously over these serious issues. I mean, bloodshed, again, local mobs killing each other. And in 1273, when the Count Otto of Tecklenburg was appointed governor of the See of Münster during the vacancy of the latter, he was essentially tasked with the consultation of an assembly for episcopal affairs made up of 7 canons, 1 count, and 5 ministeriales. Right, so even next to the clergy, the ministeriales could operate, right, and work. In 1291, King of the Romans, Rudolf of Habsburg, set up an arbitration court for cases involving the Albanian town of Weissenburg in Alsace. 14 townsmen would, when necessary, meet the abbot, convent, and 7 of his ministeriales. So again, we understand from all these examples that the ministeriales were regularly employed, even in these kind of permanent institutional issues, right? They could vary. Again, there was a great human exchange, just like all these townsmen or canons could change. Of course, some of the ministeriales could individually, but there was a given amount was institutionalized in this role, and this is particularly important. Considerable knowledge of the law was expected of those ministeriales who regularly offered counsel as vassals to their lords and who owned their manorial jurisdictions, as well as those who essentially worked as magistrates for the empire, the communes, the Landgerichte, as we've seen in all their provincial variety, and as advocates of the church, so again, culminating, arbitrating also on matters of criminal and capital importance, of course, as just mediators, arbitrators, guardians of the Landfrieden, just with their military deterrence, by the way, because, again, these ministeriales were primarily knights, so again, people you didn't really want to mess up with. At some point, they were used literally to go pick some criminals and killing them on the spot. Right, this was carried out, for example, for with the assassin of Philip of Swabia. Right, I made a video about that, the following rise of Otto Brunswick. The ministeriales went after the guy who had assassinated Philip, by the way, just for personal reasons, and cut his head on the spot. That's really the iron fist of, and there we are already in a time which public authority was even that particularly pervasive, but again, you could simply task them with these missions and would carry that out. So, quite an interesting job, I would say. Another function was as witnesses, right? While signing charters, right? They were provided by their masters with seals, so essentially adding that to the as witnesses, as proof of the fact that they were essentially legitimizing such documents with the authority of their masters, right, which was a very political statement. And of course, this ban even allowed the masters not to travel up to certain places, but just send his trustees to do it for them. Consider that we are in a largely literate society, right? So not all the ministeriales were literate, of course, and because that was not just normal in the first place. Medieval knight was, generally speaking, it was, say, a way more developed person than the average in the world at the time. But just as witnesses, right, they could, and even just through seals, just sign and leave their this mark, so that would testify for their understanding, right, of the matter, and even without, because everything was also publicly spoken, by the way, and our agreements were done on the words under oath. So there were other means in an illiterate society, largely, at least, to confirm, to give more legitimacy to a certain act than just the written part. Because in the future, you could call that ministerialis and saying, look, what did you see? What did you hear? Right? What was that agreement about? So even without, as a witness, right? So that's quite important. And in fact, here regarding the Bavarian custom, it was said these are the witnesses who heard these things done according to Bavarian custom. In 1223, more than 24 of Margrave Henry of Istria's ministeriales, so this very fringe of the empire between Italy and Germany, watched his seal affixed to a charter of donation to the Dissen Abbey. Ministeriales could also act as sworn deputies again when lands or serfs or other possessions were transferred between contracting parties, to also check if the transaction was actually carried out once the written deed had been drawn up. Because yes, you could have these agreements, but then somebody had to ensure that these were successfully enforced. Right, so remember the violence behind these guys, and there was a lot of violence just by these same contractors, these various actors, for which not everything was just solved with words, but with swords. As experienced landowners themselves, the ministeriales were entrusted with further tasks of this nature. Right, they knew how to control a territory banally. So even as a sort of police forces we've seen, they could act against enemies of these various actors. But they could also assess incomes and land values, as we've seen in the previous example. They could act as trustees in administering legacies, right? So even as inheritance experts of some sort. In 1181, the Archbishop Siegfried of Bremen commissioned one of his ministeriales, the advocate Allard, to supervise the sale of wasteland for colonization, just taking care of the matter, being on the land and making things working more smoothly. In 1220, the same Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II instructed one of his Swabian officials, Bernard of Ravensburg, to survey woods for transfer to Weissenau Abbey. So all was one with assessing even who occupied that land, why, what they said, because normally medieval justice was also a lot about these witnesses, as we've seen, properly, because it was difficult sometimes, even with the documents available, to simply say, well, but this document is valid or not, we need to check other charges, etc. But there may have been customs and practice, etc., that from a local point of view could be better discerned and resolved accordingly, which again, with this true distractions, burning of charters, things this, like especially in a place like Germany where lots of public prerogatives were being usurped, right? Exactly in that 13th century, it could be really a relevant way of coping, even though the general privatization of the system, the interregnum, the rise of the princes would bring to, say, matters being resolved in a less sort of, in fact, surgical way, just with a broader deal between these princes, even, bypassing the injustice person. That's also why the Ministeriales, in a sense, decline, right? But they had, at least in these previous centuries, a great legacy, in the same great role in the system of suretyship. That is to say, legal arrangements of all kinds, right, as well exchanges, pledges, and purchases of real property were guaranteed by their presence. These rules of suretyship could vary, of course, dramatically in time and place in medieval Germany. Again, everything was that fluid and free in a way, according to, of course, to the rule of the land. However, it was accepted that one of the duties of knights, serfs, or freemen alike was to offer the surety for lords in their more significant transactions, just by the role. They had to assist, comfort, and advise him, right? As such, the Ministeriales offered such service to all the various masters, but also to their fellow knights, should it be required. The charter recording the transactions stated which knights had been appointed as fideusores of sureties, that is to say, they were the ones who would testify with conferring more legitimacy to whichever process, like just the same, let's say the same witnesses, the same judgment as we've seen. There was also a time limit by which they had sworn that their principals would have to fulfill the terms according. And should the limit be exceeded, as we've seen, then they were be held responsible and were liable of confinement as oath breakers until the terms were fulfilled by themselves of their principals, right? Because of course, if they hadn't been formally provided with the properly the legitimacy themselves of speaking on behalf of their lords, which was not automatic, right? You were not a just because you belong to someone as ministerials could go around saying I do whatever I want on behalf of my master. No, right? You would be punished, and so there were all strict regulations to ensure, like for anybody else at that point, but with this extra care for somebody that was again meant to be just an extension of somebody more important. To watch or to surveil them, right? In effect, the Ministeriales committed themselves as hostages of some sort for good faith, right? Also because, yes, they were dangerous men capable of defending themselves and getting out of very unlikely situations, let's put it this way. But of course, as individuals, they would go in somebody else's castles, lands. They risked for their life. They were used as guards, as escorts, as all, as we've seen, even as police, as garrisons. So they carried with themselves the sword, literally, and so that sort of nobility that could accompany also the serf. It's a bit like, think about the Mamluks. They were even more important than the average freeman, right? But they still were serfs. It's a shaded complex. Remember that Knecht from Landsknecht derives, it just means servant, right, in a feudal sense. So reflect on this continuity also in German society. But we will talk about it. But in any case, I made a video about that, so 2.5 hours of pure German brutality. But that's beautiful, actually, in the understanding of how relevant it was for this man to be, in fact, in that sort of limbo condition that could allow them to work for the public order, right, and essentially putting an end to abuses, to all these pretty sneaky attempts of the nobility to do whatever they wanted to erode royal authority in Germany and so on. They were said to be bound under peril of imprisonment according to the common custom of the land in general, because they embodied the same communities. They were not just somebody else's people. They were a sort of stand on their own, right? Sort of estate on their own. And in order to make payment according to the custom of suretyship in the place stipulated, because, as we've seen, they moved a lot. This was a characteristic. Right? Since the commitments were most commonly made for financial transactions, by the way, because that's how most lords interacted with one another, there were terminal dates a few weeks or months ahead, and the Ministeriales were afforded some latitude, at least for seeing that payment was made in time. So they escorted the same money, they just supervised, generally speaking, how these transactions occurred, and so on. And so this security offered in more serious circumstances would never come less together with these juridical occupations. In 1236, when the Bishop Ludolf of Münster negotiated peace between the Count Otto of Tecklenburg and the Bishop Conrad of Osnabrück, the former obliged to hand over 20 ministeriales to the arbitrator in this dispute as security for his future good behavior. In other words, if the guy had misbehaved, this ministeriales could be simply imprisoned, right, by the terms of the same treaty withstanding between the two parties, and this and the general supervision, so that these were all quite serious matters. Remember, in a world in which, yes, again, you are somebody else's guy that has a power, etc., but which there was enormous violence, so in which you couldn't quite simply hope to get out alive. You could think that, I don't know, the king could come and save you if things went wrong. You somehow hadn't chosen that lifestyle, because mostly the families of ministeriales remained about the business. They didn't have much other choice. This was actually a privilege, right? But it was just the, let's say, a bit the norm of that world, that sort of violent and unruly, and with this very unstable political reality, where more than in other places you would essentially be without much of a point of reference, other than, in fact, these guys that you belong to, right? So that's why, again, these people were also so faithful, because they literally had a greater let's say, necessity of being protected in a stateless reality, and the state was made, in a sense, by the effort of these people, and ultimately even with a negative outcome. So the system just collapsed as far as that public dimension was concerned, and the strongest took over. And in a sense, from there, other things happened, but let's say, indeed, nobody would manage to re-establish a national monarchy and political unity on the same base in the country. So it's actually a sad story, a dramatic story in the first place, that speaks of all the amount of abuses that these people were called to try to stem. Right, and of course there were violent, unruly, let's say ruthless ministeriales that didn't really play by the law. But this could be, in fact, this was part of the deal. Like, all these various masters would have ministeriales, and if the situation arose for which they could, say, usurp certain public prerogatives, or just participating in some harassment, etc., they would send them. And as one, you would also have to be loyal in that regard. So that's even more, that really makes you think in general. In any case, we're talking, say, overall, German history appears cyclically right here, and it's important really to make it in depth. We talked a lot about Ministeriales. We have to talk about the free knights as well, and I hope we'll get more about that point. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.